"It is finished." You notice that? After he had received the vinegar or the sour wine, he said, "It is finished," and he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. Now this little expression, "it is finished," I think is very important. That says it pretty clearly, it is finished. Other translations say it is accomplished. Another translation says everything is completed. I don't know if yours say anything like that. King, does yours say something different?
No, it just says it's finished.
Yeah. I've seen lots of different ones. Usually they either say it is finished or everything is accomplished or everything is done. That's good. So here's my thought. Something got finished in his death. If he said it is finished as he died, or as another translation says, it is accomplished, that means something, his death accomplished something. That's what I'm getting to. His death finished something. His death accomplished something. Something got done in his death. Now what I'm speaking to is the question, what does the death of one man 2,000 years ago have to do with me? Well, you see, that's the wrong way to look at it. If we look at it as the death of one man 2,000 years ago, the right assumption is, or the right conclusion to draw is, what does that have to do with me? But you see, it wasn't just the death of one man 2,000 years ago. That one man was a stand-in. He was standing in for all of us. He received something that was wrong with us into his person, into himself, and died doing something for us. Now, he says it is finished, or it is accomplished, and so I take from that something got finished, something got accomplished, something got done, and we could stand here and discuss and speculate, and we could stand here and ponder and say, well, I think it means this, or I think it means that, or here's what I think got done, or here's what somebody else thinks got done. We could talk about that, and that might be interesting, but we don't have to do that. We don't have to speculate. We don't have to ponder it. We can just read it for ourselves, because the Apostle Paul tells us what got done. Now here's an interesting thing. The disciples that followed Jesus around during his 3.5-year earthly ministry, they didn't really understand what got done. They saw it happen physically. They saw him die. But they didn't know why. They didn't know the relevance, because they couldn't see what was happening in the invisible realm, God's realm. They couldn't see what was accomplished. So they didn't know. You know, if you go on reading in the story from the different Gospels, you find out that after this happened, his disciples ran away and hid themselves. They didn't rejoice. They didn't say, this is God's salvation. They went and hid. They locked the doors. You know what they thought? And this is a logical assumption. Wow. They thought, this is the guy we've been following for 3 years. Look what happened to him. What's liable to happen to me if I hang around here very long? You know, Peter went so far as to deny him when they said, you were with him. Remember that? They were afraid for their lives. And it's understandable. But you see, it took a revelation from God of what happened that they couldn't see. Because God accomplished something during this death that they couldn't see. But God could see it. And he wanted us to know about it. And interestingly, the man he chose to reveal it was a man who was, at the time when this was happening, an enemy of Christ. And I'm talking about Paul the Apostle, who was called Saul at that time. He was a Pharisee. He was, after the church got started in the book of Acts, for the first 8 chapters, he was a persecutor of the Christians. He persecuted them. He didn't believe in Jesus. He didn't believe that Jesus was anything other than the Jews saw him as a heretical teacher. Paul didn't, in those days called Saul, but Jesus decided this man Saul, later to be called Paul, we know him as Paul, is a man that he wanted to use to carry his message. And you know, Jesus can just choose anybody he wants. You know, he didn't have to get anybody's permission. You know, when Jesus decided to use Saul, and we know him as Paul, he didn't go to the 12 apostles who were like the ones, he didn't go and ask for their permission. He didn't even tell them. He didn't even inform them. He just went to he went to this man Saul and appeared to him on the road to Damascus. And Paul, when he saw this great light, he said, he heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you, Lord? He said, I'm Jesus, the one you're persecuting. And he probably said, oh, whoops, I guess. He probably thought that, although it doesn't record that. But anyway, Jesus said, I have appeared to you for this purpose. Here's why, in other words, to make you a witness of the things which you have seen, meaning that experience, and the things of the which I will appear to you. He said, I have appeared to you, I want you to tell about this, and, see, that gives him some authority, and the things I will appear to you. So Jesus came to Paul, and the thing that he told him, the thing he gave him, Paul tells us that the gospel that he preached, he didn't learn it from men. He didn't get it from Peter, James, and John. He got it directly from Jesus. Jesus explained to him what took place at the cross that nobody else could see, what was being accomplished. So we don't have to speculate about what was finished, what was accomplished, what was done. Paul tells us in plain language what was done. So I want to read one of those today. There's lots of places he's just filled with this information, but the one I like best for the purpose of saving time is in Colossians chapter 1. And thank you, Troy, for figuring that out. Appreciate that. I don't know if I would know how to find Colossians chapter 1, and I want to begin reading with, I want to get back and get a run at it. And let's start with verse 12. And I'm going to just read a few. Colossians chapter 1, verse 12. Paul here says, giving thanks unto the Father, which hath made us meet. And that word meet there, we don't use it that way today. In the King James language, that means fit or qualified. Giving thanks to the Father, which has made us qualified to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light, who hath delivered us from the power of darkness, and hath translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son. That's all important information, but we don't have time to stop there right now. In whom we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins. So right away, in verse 14, he's talking about his blood. Now, the only place I ever read where Jesus shed any blood was at the cross, when he died on the cross. So Paul here, when he talks about his blood, is talking about the death of Christ. You remember that Jesus said, it is finished, it is accomplished. So the first thing he tells us that was accomplished is we have redemption, we're redeemed, that is, we're bought back from our condition of being in the power of darkness. It says we have redemption through his blood, and then he says even, or here it is specifically, the forgiveness of sins. We have forgiveness of sins because of his death. Now, remember, Jesus on the cross said, it is finished, it is accomplished. Now, Paul here says, through his blood we have forgiveness of sins. So I'm saying to you that one thing that was accomplished by his death was our forgiveness of sins. Now, we think, why am I telling you this? Why am I spending a lot? See, we like to think there's something we do that gets us forgiveness of sins. People like to think that way. And through church history, people have thought all kinds of different things that we do that gives us forgiveness of sins. But I'm telling you that there's something Jesus did that gives us forgiveness of sins. It's not what we do. Now, we have lots of ways to respond to it. And that's what all the things that we do, like baptism, which is a symbol. Well, baptism and the Lord's Supper, which is the cup. And at the Lord's Supper, Jesus said, this cup is my blood of the New Testament, shed for many, for the remission of sins. Now, you can read church history and find times when people in the Middle Ages especially, they thought that the Lord's Supper forgave sins. If I drink this little cup of wine, that forgives my sins. No, a little cup of wine doesn't take your sins away. Jesus' death on the cross took your sins away. And that little cup of wine represents that. It's your way of acknowledging and receiving what he already did. But you see, it's not the drinking of the little cup of wine, or in our case, grape juice, that takes away sin. A little cup of grape juice doesn't take away sin. But it symbolizes that which did take it away, his death on the cross. Through his blood, we have forgiveness of sins. Right away, baptism was a rite that was practiced by the church. People got the mistaken notion that baptism takes sin away. Listen, getting under the water doesn't take your sin away, but it symbolizes the death of Christ, which did take your sin away. And I know this from reading history, that many times people who had active public lives, like emperors, for instance, Christian emperors. The first one was Constantine. They would delay their baptism until they knew they were dying. You know why? Because they thought that baptism took their sins away. And that if they ever did a sin after that, then, I can't get baptized again, so I'm just guilty. They thought they'd lost it. That's what they thought. They thought the baptism takes your sins away, and so they would wait. They would delay their baptism until they knew they were under Constantine. The first Christian emperor did this. Why? Because he knew as an emperor he had to make a lot of policy decisions that were not necessarily good moral decisions. And he was guilty, and he knew he felt guilty. So many times people in public life would delay their baptism because they mistakenly thought that baptism washes sins away. I'm here to tell you today, baptism does not wash sins away, but it represents a death that did wash your sins away. Is that all right? Yeah, it's true anyway. And so but you see, if that's what you think, then you'd be right. If that's what you think, you'd be right. Now today, in modern day charismatic Christianity, we think that confession of sins takes your sins away. And I'm sorry to have to tell you that Confession of sins does not take sins away.